Good morning, everybody. If you have your Bible, grab it. Turn to 1 Peter, 1 Peter 1. Just to kind of tie with what Chris said, in a couple weeks, it'll probably get really busy here. And part of you, probably some of you are like, it's already super busy here. It's going to get busier. I want you to pretend you're flying on a really cheap airline. That's how close I want you to be to one another. It's going to be great, okay? So park where you don't want to park, sit where you don't want to sit. If you feel like you're uncomfortably close to your neighbor, you're just about where you need to be. Those seams on the seats are suggestions. They're not really guidelines. So in all honesty, our capacity, because of Easter, we're trying to fit it in the morning, we are very likely going to use every single seat, and that's if everyone came uniquely dispersed at the right times, and the odds of that happening are 0. So it's going to be really busy. So we appreciate you just having eyes to see and being a greeting team for us that's a few hundred large. Okay, cool. 1 Peter 1, verse 6. In this you rejoice, though now for a little while, if necessary, you have been grieved by various trials, so that the tested genuineness of your faith, more precious than gold that perishes, though it is tested by fire, may be found to result in praise and glory and honor at the revelation of Jesus Christ. Though you have not seen him, you love him. Though you do not now see him, you believe in him and rejoice with a joy that is inexpressible and filled with glory, obtaining the outcome of your faith, the salvation of your souls. Peter is writing to a group of people that are scattered throughout an area where they would have never seen Jesus, they would have never met Jesus, they would have never watched him do any of the things that he did. They're disconnected from the large group of Christian believers in Jerusalem. They're out in what is now modern-day Turkey. And he's writing to a church that is experiencing more and more hostility culturally and socially as Christians are becoming a more targeted group. They're more marginalized, they're more afflicted, and life will only get worse for them in the next 30 to 40 years. And so he writes this letter to them, and when he writes a letter, I think most of the time, like when we get a letter, we just want you to get to the point. Get to the point. I've said this to people, and it's super rude, and I'm working on it. Sometimes I say, get there faster, okay? Right, get to the point. And up until this point, it seems like Peter doesn't know what they're going through. Seems like he's unaware that life is not very easy for them and that life has gone actually really poorly for them. Finally, today, he'll get into talking about suffering, but what Peter has done is set the stage that before we talk about what's happening in your life, you got to know some things that are true about who God is. And that's true for all of us. Before we can talk about certain circumstances in our own lives, we got to know some things that are true about God. One, he's alive. And because he's alive, we have a living hope that doesn't perish, can't be taken from us. And we learned last week, not only do you have a living hope, but God is guarding you through faith, meaning that even when you look down at your future and it looks dark and it looks scary, the reality is God is with you. The promise isn't that you don't go through it. The promise is that he goes through it with you. And then to make that promise even more amazing, he says, I'm going to guard your faith that it will not fail you in the times when it will be tested the most. So he starts out now, we're talking about really two categories. So verses 6 and 7 are about trials. And trials are going to look different. We're going to get into that. And then verses 8 and 9 are about faith and hope. And so the way Paul has really laid out an argument, it probably should have been 1 week, but it was 2 weeks with Blaine. So it was about the gospel, it was about suffering, and it was about hope. And so let's look at it. In this you rejoice. This is not a natural thing that happens when life is going poorly. Is that fair? Our natural instinct is to complain. If you've ever traveled with me, I complain like crazy. Janice tells people if they're ever going to fly anywhere with me, she goes, you just need to be ready because he complains all the time. And she hasn't ever traveled with me. She just heard stories, right? I complain a lot. I don't rejoice when things are hard or difficult. And so Peter's going to tell them to rejoice, and then he's going to start talking about their circumstances. But we notice that Peter already did this. He's already talked about the joy that's found in this new Savior, in this new life, this new hope. And now he's telling them, I need you to rejoice. This is not the same as happiness. Let me give you an example. I'll use Dan. I used Dan in the first service. I didn't even ask him if I could do this. I just decided it felt right. Dan got a really cool camping trailer, and we all applauded it, and we were super excited. He drove down to Colorado to pick it up. He was super happy. And then his engine blew up, and his car is still there. It's not funny. And then he was super sad, right? Okay, so here's the point. Happiness can be taken from it, can it? You can get real happy about stuff, and then you can be real sad about stuff. I told the first group, Ellie, my daughter, when we go to Target, we go there a lot, probably too much. Graham called it his store for a while. That's how many times we were there. And we promised our kids we straight bribe them. Like, if you just don't fight me or yell at me in the store, we'll buy you a treat. And the treat is a cake pop at Starbucks. My daughter instinctively knows which ones are the most expensive, and she picks those ones, even though she can't read. Can't tell you how many times she's taken one ridiculously small bite and the whole thing falls on the ground. You know what I'm talking about? And you're like, how is that even possible? You'd be amazed what she can do. One small bite, it falls off, and she goes from literally hopping, like she hops when she's happy. She skips, and she's very, very excited, and then just screaming, crying, right? Happiness gets taken from you. Peter's not talking about circumstantial happiness, because a lot of times we think about joy, we think about circumstantial happiness. You can buy something on Amazon and be really happy in 2 days and then be really sad in 3. Right? When it breaks or when it's the wrong thing. Like, happiness is circumstantial. And what Peter's telling this church is, I need you to rejoice. But he's saying in this rejoice, it's connecting to what they're rejoicing in. What they rejoice in is what Jesus has done, that Jesus is alive, and that he's going to help them and guard them and protect their faith. That's what they are to rejoice in. So joy is deeper. It's deeper than just happiness. It encompasses happiness, but it's deeper than it. Does that make sense? So he says, in this rejoice. And then he goes on to say something that is not what we want to hear. The Bible often tells you things like this, and you go, okay, I could do that. Rejoice. Done. I'm super happy right now. Then you read the next line. Though now for a little while, if necessary, you have been grieved by various trials. There's certain verses in the Bible that have never made sense to me. They're starting to make sense to me. But when you first read them, I don't like them. Jesus looking at his disciples saying, in this world you will have trouble. I don't like that. And then he goes, but take heart. And we go, oh, yes, good. I've overcome the world. Okay, what about us? Right? Like, am I not the only guy that would be like, excuse me, speaking for all of us, what about us? The promise is that Jesus was strong enough, not that you would be. That Jesus would deal with your problems and with your failures and with your sin when you couldn't. That Jesus would overcome when you could not. He doesn't say in this life you're going to have trouble, but don't worry, I found the secret way out. He doesn't say that. And so Peter tells him, rejoice, even though for a little while, if necessary, you've been grieved by various trials. That sounds rude, doesn't it? Because so let me just say something as a pastor, like, about how we love people. Don't minimize people's hurts, okay? This is not Peter going, really? Okay, it's fine. It's a boo-boo. You're going to be okay. I do this with my kids. In my house, the rule is if you're not bleeding, it's not bad, okay? Which is ironic because every time I've been hurt, I didn't bleed. I just broke everything inside. And so I can't tell you how many times my kids have come up and they're screaming. And I'm like, listen, it's really not that big of a deal. The other day, Graham is starting to lose a lot of his teeth. It's pretty exciting. And he was playing with Justine, and Justine reached back, and when she did, she hit him. She's going to tell you they were playing. I don't know. I'm not convinced. And so he starts crying, and that's normal stuff around our house. And he goes, it hurts. And I'm like, you're going to be all right. Because this is what I always say, because I'm insensitive and I'm not nice. He rounds the corner, and one of his front teeth, they're working their way the wrong direction, but one of them is pointing at me, like it's waving. And there's a lot of blood, and I almost passed out. I was like, I can't do this. Like, if you were a nurse in here or a doctor, I just think you're amazing. I've been to the hospital, and I don't do really well. I sat down. I had to sit down. I was like, oh, gosh. And Justine's like, I don't do well with blood. I'm like, well, if you don't do well with blood, call your mom, because neither of us call somebody. Get somebody else in here. And he's like pulling, and he's covered in blood, and I'm like freaking out. Okay. The point of the story is that was a big deal for him. I don't go, come on, man. Some people have lost 2 teeth at the same time. My father one time crashed on his bicycle, lost all 4 of his front teeth at the same time. The right time to tell that story to my son is not when he's about to lose 1. There's a sense of tact and sensitivity, and what feels really harsh and really almost aggressive from Peter is not to be aggressive. There is a time to speak theological truth to people because they need to hear it. And there's times to just hurt with people. This is not giving us license to walk into the hospital room and say, listen, it's not as bad as the person I just saw down the hall. That's not what he's saying. Though now for a little while. It never feels like a little while when you're in it. Is that fair? Anytime you suffer, whatever that suffering looks like, it never feels like, looks like a little while. But he's not saying, listen, it's really not that bad. You're going to be fine. It's not a big deal. It's not what he's saying. He's telling them to keep one eye in eternity as they look at what's happening in their life. Paul would say it this way in Romans 8, "For I consider that the sufferings of this present time are not worth comparing to the glory that is to be revealed to us." What he's saying is theologically, in contrast, compared to eternity, this isn't that long. Even if you suffer your entire life, you live to be 100 years old, in light of eternity, that's not that long. James would say that your life is a vapor. It's like walking out on a cold morning and taking one breath out. Like that. That's how your life is. So he's not telling them, you're going to be fine, just stop complaining. That's not what he's saying. He's trying to remind these people of some things that are true about God so that they can deal with suffering appropriately. Mother Teresa said this, "In light of heaven, the worst suffering on earth, a life full of the most atrocious tortures on earth, will be seen as no more serious than one night in an inconvenient hotel." How many of you have ever stayed in a bad hotel? You ever done that? I'm super cheap, as you can tell by my finding the cheap cake pop at Starbucks story, right? We went on a missions trip, one of my first years as a high school pastor here. My son was 1. It's our first, so we're already like very germ focused. By the time your second one rolls around, you're like, they'll be all right. And I picked a motel. Yes, a motel, not a hotel, a motel. And I swear I got it for like $20 a night. And I was like, this is amazing. Like I'm the best shopper ever. And so we drove 16 hours with kids. So we had a 1-year-old in each car, and then we had high school kids surrounding them. So I don't know if you've ever traveled like that. It's the worst thing in the history of mankind. Like you traveling with teenagers and babies at the same time is the worst. And so we pull up. It was a rough trip. Just get out of the car, leave me alone, don't talk to me, touch me. I don't even want to see you. This is me talking to everybody, even my own family. This is not a good day. We walk into the roughest motel I've ever seen in my life. And I didn't sleep much because my wife was letting me know how awful it was. Now, the great joke was the next 7 days we slept in our car on this trip. Now, things went different than we thought. One night in that hotel felt like eternity in that room, right? You're like looking at the clock, you're like, wow, it's still night, and we still can't leave, right? But looking back, it was just one night. Here's what he's saying. It's like that, though for a little while. Doesn't mean that while you're in it, it doesn't feel like an eternity. It just means that it's not eternity. He's trying to refocus our hearts and our minds. Then he says something that's really confusing. And honestly, feels like the little print at the bottom of a document, if necessary. And this is where most of us go, praise Jesus. There is an exception clause, and I'm pretty sure I meet it. Probably you don't. I don't think that if necessary means that there's a possibility that you can follow Jesus in this life and have no pain. That is not real. There is no such thing as living a human life and having no pain, no loss, and no hurt. That life doesn't exist. We can tell ourselves it exists. It does not exist. And following Jesus, it definitely doesn't exist. Luke 14, Jesus would look at large crowds that would follow, and he'd say, I don't know why you're following me. Your life is about to get a lot worse. And they're like, whoa. And then they stopped following him. A great moment. He looks at Peter. He goes, you want to leave too? It's a great moment if you're Peter. Peter always speaks first. And so Jesus is like, why don't you tell, what do you want to do, Peter? You want to go? Peter's kind of like, kinda. Like, but I literally don't know where else I'd find eternal life. Like, you're getting more unpopular. We were pretty excited when people were showing up and telling us how awesome we are, and then you scared them all away, and now they don't think we're awesome. So yeah, that's a bummer. But where else will we find life? Following Jesus does not promise you an easy life. In fact, Jesus himself promises you a more difficult life. But here's the trade-off, that whatever it might cost you to follow Jesus in this life will more than pay for itself in eternity. If necessary, it is necessary. I think there's 2 ways that suffering is necessary. One, it can be a consequence of our sinful choices. Now, hear me, because this can be misinterpreted really quickly. I'm not saying that if you do something that God is going to punish you and that God's going to, crush you. And that's not what I'm saying. I'm saying that sinful choices have consequences. Many of us can look back in our life and go, man, I wish I wouldn't have made that choice because I would have saved myself a lot of heartache. Growing up, as many of you know, I ride bicycles and I used to ride motorcycles. I got a bike because I thought it'd be safer. And if you've been here longer than a year, you know that that's not true. And I spent a considerable amount of time in my high school and college years going to the hospital. No blood, ironically, just everything inside was broken. And there was a sticker, Honda had a slogan back then, and it was called "Stupid Hurts." And that was what my parents would tell me all the time, constantly. My dad especially, "Stupid hurts." So I'd do something stupid, and it would hurt. When I broke my leg last summer, I sent a picture of that Band-Aid slogan that said "Stupid hurts" to my family, and they're like, "What did you do?" Sometimes you make a bad choice, and it results in a consequence. Forgiveness and grace does not mean that we ignore that it happened or that we forget that it happened or that you get to walk back into life the way it was before you sinned with no problems or no issues. An example I've used with teenagers, I said, if you come to my house to watch my kids, God bless you, if you come to my house and watch my kids and then you steal something from my house, I don't know what you would take, but if you steal something from my house, you're not going to babysit again. I can forgive you. I can extend grace, but you're not going to come back over and house sit for me next week. There are consequences in our life for decisions that we make. So that doesn't mean that God hasn't forgiven you. Maybe you're living with some consequences of some choices you made in your life. That doesn't mean that God is constantly reminding you and trying to tell you how broken and ruined you are. He's not doing that. But there are consequences sometimes to sinful choices. Sometimes we sin and there aren't any long-term consequences and there aren't any even perceived consequences. We just are forgiven, and sometimes there are. The second way is that God is sovereignly working in your life in ways that you don't see. I told you last week that the idea of being conformed in the image of Jesus is a really painful thing. Because if you put Jesus on one side and you put me on the other, I don't look anything like him. I don't act like him. I don't default to being like him. My default is anger, not patience. I'm quick to speak. I'm not quick to listen. Me and Jesus are opposites. So someone's got to change in that. A verse that people all love to quote in Christian world is that God is working all things together for the good of those who are called according to his purposes. We go, that's beautiful. Amen. Except for the next part that says to be conformed to the image of Jesus. God's working for your good, and the good is to be like him. And sometimes that means you're going to have to be conformed, and that process is uncomfortable. And so when we look at this idea of if necessary, sometimes God is working in your life in ways you don't see. Sometimes God is working for your good and for the good of those around you. Sometimes your suffering demonstrates a faith and a foundation in a God who is bigger than your problems, and your coworkers have never seen anything like that before. They don't have a category for that. They've never seen someone suffer and still love the Lord. And so maybe the Lord is working through your suffering for the good of other people. I don't know. I wouldn't pretend to know. I've been to enough hospital visits where I had no answers and no words. I didn't know what to say. There was nothing to say. I'm not God. I don't know, but here's what I do know, that God knows. The point that Peter's making is not that you're being punished or that you stepped out of line, so now you got smacked. That's not what he's saying. He's simply saying that it is necessary for us as believers to be at times conformed, and sometimes that happens through trials. Now listen, this is what I'm not saying. This is not Christian karma. Right? Like we often live like this, where we think like, I had a really good week, I read my Bible, I told someone about Jesus, I was on this is usually like January 1st through January 3rd. You started the new Bible reading plan, you know what I'm talking about? You're killing it. By the second you have to read 2 days to catch up, because of the first, that's a pass. But you're killing it. And you walk into church, you're like, I belong here. These are my people. But then the next week, right, you're yelling at your kids driving to church in the van. Right? Don't act like this doesn't happen, right? And before the doors open up, you're like, just don't talk. You ever been there? Like, I just don't want to hear you or see you. I love you. Don't tell anyone about this conversation. We'll meet back up at the van after church. Right? Like there's these moments. Have you ever felt like, man, I don't belong in church today? I really shouldn't go to church. When I worked at the hospital, I was a maintenance worker. And I used to tell people that I was a pastor I don't know if that was real. I was part-time. I wasn't even getting paid. I was an intern without pay at a church. I rounded up, called myself a pastor. And every time I told someone, they always gave me the weirdest answers and replies. My favorite is well, I'm spiritual. I remember thinking, man, I'm going to be in your office for another hour building this desk. I wish you wouldn't have done that. Because this is now really weird. And we would have these weird conversations, and everyone was like, no, well, yeah, I'm good. If I went to a church, God would kill me. I'm like, wow. But I really need to finish this desk, right? And I've talked to people, I can never go back to church. If I walked in there, the roof would collapse. And I'm like, man, stop hating on church buildings. They're not that bad. There's this temptation that all of us feel that if we've had a good week, God is like, yes, good work. And if we had a bad week, he's like, you should wait a week before you walk back into my room. That's Christian karma. That's me believing that if I'm really, really good, then God's going to love me. And if I'm not so good, then I got to work really hard so God will love me again. That's not the Bible. It's not Christianity. It's not what Jesus teaches. Let me give you an example. Luke 13. Jesus is going to ask some questions and then quickly answer them for some people. Luke 13, verse 1. There was some present at that very time who told him about the Galileans whose blood Pilate had mingled with their sacrifices. And he answered them, this is Jesus speaking, do you think that these Galileans were worse sinners than the other Galileans because they suffered in this way? No. I tell you, but unless you repent, you all likewise perish. Or those 18 on whom the Tower of Siloam fell and killed them, do you think that they were worse offenders than all the others who lived in Jerusalem? No. I tell you, but unless you repent, you will all likewise perish. So here's the question Jesus answers for them. Okay, a tower fell. This is an architecture problem, right? Engineering failure. Tower falls, kills 18 people. Would have made it to the local news. This stuff like this makes it to the local news, doesn't it? Jesus goes, okay, were they worse off than anyone else here? And no doubt, people are like, I don't know, probably. A tower fell on them. I would think that's not good. And Jesus answers. He doesn't even let them talk. No. They're no worse than any other sinner. Now, here's where he switches it on them. He goes, not only are they not any worse, this is all of your story. It is the grace of God that hasn't happened to you today. So while today is still today and you are still breathing, you should repent and turn from your sin and put your trust in the one who can save you from your sin, because you are all equally sinful, and what you saw happen to them will ultimately happen to all of you. Jesus does not say, you're right, they were a little bit worse. You should have heard what they were talking about, and I made that tower just come on down. It's not what he says. No, it wasn't any worse. But listen, here's the thing. Everybody alive then is dead now. So what Jesus said is true. Now here's the lie that we believe. Well, that might not happen to us. Eventually, give it 100 years. The 100-year one is always a pretty fair one. I'm gone. You're all gone. Unless you're bionic, let's say 150, you're not making it. Right? 100 years, you're all gone. So what Jesus is saying is, listen, you're looking at the right here, right now, and asking about specific examples. Is God out to crush me? He's going, listen, eternity is around the corner. You need to take seriously the one who actually rules and reigns in eternity. Then he goes on, you have been grieved by various trials. Now, here's the admission that no Christian suffers in the same way. In this room, I know personal stories of suffering, of different types, different intensity, different durations. Some are internal, some are external. One of the weird things about this job is I know a lot of hurts. I know a lot of hurts when I go home at the end of the day. When I go to the hospital, I usually see more than one person at a time. There are various trials represented in this room right now. Some of them have been spoken, some of them have not. Some of them are obvious, some of them are not. There is a variety. And so here's how we need to handle that as Christians. One is be empathetic and sympathetic. I'll give you a great example. Sherry Mason, who's with the Lord right now. Near the end of her life, I had just ruined my leg. Some of you remember how horribly awkward it was for me to get on the stage. So I go to see her, and they made me put the gown on, which is a pretty easy task if you have arms and legs that are working. I dropped my crutch, was leaning up against the wall. I fell into the chair at one point. it was rough to watch. In fact, the nurses watched. They didn't help, they watched. And I was like, I don't know, it was awful. So I made more noise than anyone had ever made on that floor for like 5 minutes, which should have taken 10 seconds. I come into the room winded. Like, this is not a joke. I wasn't in great shape, apparently. Winded from standing there putting a shirt on. And I sit down in the chair, and when I sat down, the crutches caught me and basically shot me into the chair. It was, seriously, this is not a joke. This is why you don't want me to come and visit you. I don't bring any help. I just come make a scene. I make people laugh. I sit down, and Sherry, before I can catch my breath, she goes, "How are you doing? I'm worried about your leg." I'm like, okay, I think my leg is not really that big of a deal. Sherry didn't look at me and go, "You know what, Blaine? You're kind of making a scene, and this is embarrassing." She could have said that. And she didn't say, "What I'm going through is a lot worse than what you're going through," because that was true. She didn't compare. She didn't contrast. She didn't go, "Well, you think you're having a hard day? Imagine what I'm going through." That we all walk through various trials. And listen, that might not be today. Maybe that's you right now, and it doesn't feel short, and it doesn't feel slow. It doesn't feel like eternity's coming. It feels like it's taking forever. Maybe you're in the room, and when you hear, maybe for a little while you'll suffer, you're going, it's been a lot longer than a little while. And maybe you're in the room going, I don't know that that's my story. I don't think I might make it through. You won't. We're all going to suffer in different ways. We're all going to be grieved by various trials. There is no standard for what makes suffering suffering. In every church, you will find different types of suffering, different intensities of suffering, different durations of suffering, but it's all suffering. Don't compare yourself to others. Don't talk down about others. I have watched in this church people care for one another in a way that can only be explained because the Holy Spirit's moving. Not competing for who had it worse. I've watched people who are struggling in their own life look at people who are not struggling as bad and tell you, "I've prayed for you every day." And I know they mean it. Various trials hit. And listen, this church is not just facing cultural pressures. There's no doubt there's health issues there. There's relational issues there. There's pain on all kinds of levels. Some of it is deeply hidden. Some of it is incredibly obvious. Then he goes on to verse 7, "So that the tested genuineness of your faith, more precious than gold that perishes though it is tested by fire." So here's what trials do. They show that you mean it. It's easy to say, "I love Jesus." It's easy to say that Jesus is Lord. It's easy to say that until it costs you something. Jesus was familiar with this. How many times did people come to Jesus and go, "We're in. We're so in. You're so great. We want to follow you. When's lunch?" Right? And Jesus would go, "Hey, I'm homeless. Are you willing to be homeless?" Like literally, he would say that to people. And they're like, "Oh, I forgot. I've got something at my house I got to go get. I'll never see you again." He would never come back. There's something about testing and refining and trials that show whether or not you actually believe what you say. You know what an unbelieving world is looking for? They want to know if you mean it. You serious about this?
I don't know.
Oh, Siri doesn't know what I mean by that. Last time it crashed in the middle and I just went no notes. So that you guys should be happy because that can go to some weird places. Like they want to know you mean it. Do you believe it? When you say, "I'm a follower of Jesus," if that costs you everything, would you still follow him? People will know when they watch you hurt. Like, listen, when you're like, "I'm a Christian, I got a promotion," people are like, "I hate you." Like, "Hey, I'm a Christian and following Jesus cost me my job." People listen. The tested genuineness of your faith. There's two things that he compares it with now with gold. Two things that gold does. One, gold is refined through fire. It's like if you ever been given a $100 bill and you're like, "I don't know about this." Like, am I the only one that always thinks someone's giving me fake money? Like every time, I went to the bank the other day to buy something on Craigslist, and it spat out 100. I was like, no. Because I was convinced they were going to be like, "This isn't a real $100 bill. And I was going to have no way to prove it and be out $100, right? And they're always looking up in the light. I'm like, I should learn what that does. Like, I guess I could Google that. It'd probably take me 2 seconds to figure out what they're doing. But every time I'm like, you ever have that mild anxiety attack when you're watching them check your $100 bill? You're like, oh. And they're like, okay, it's good. I'm like, oh my gosh, I've never had that much money in my life. And now I was so worried. Same thing with gold, except it was a little more of a process than looking at a light. They'd burn it. And real gold would be refined by fire, and fake gold would just be consumed by fire. You know that real gold was real gold because when you put heat on it, it was still gold. And then he gives another thing, though. It's tested by fire, but it also perishes. So in the same way that the faith of a believer is tested and refined through trials, and it demonstrates that it is real and solid, same way that gold is, the difference is gold still perishes. Gold's still short term. Like think about the most valuable thing in your entire life. Some of you guys are like, I don't know. I have to sit down and think for a while. Everything I have is valuable is for my children, it seems like. If you've been to my garage, it's basically a storage unit for kids. It's horrible. I don't have anything of value anymore. I think all of my stuff has been taken by children, right? My most valuable thing is their bikes because it helps them be quiet, right? That's my most valuable treasure, right? You think about whatever it is, the most valued thing that you have ever had. It'll be in a garage sale soon. And you ever been to a garage sale? You ever watch people at garage sales? Garage sales are great. I hate them. I will never go. Like some people are like, I'm so into garage selling. I'm like, that's like my nightmare. To get cash out that I'm not even sure if it's real money and then go barter with someone at their house for stuff that they don't want anymore. I'm not sure about that. People are like, it's great deals. Yeah, there's not great deals if you give your whole life to looking for it, okay? So anyways, this is just me. Me and Justine are different when it comes to garage sales. But when you go to a garage sale, people offer you obscene money for stuff, right? Like asking $20 for your lawnmower. Like, I'll give you 50 cents. And I want all the clothes I can fit in my car. Add it in. I'm always like, good. I'm in, because I'm going to pay $11 at the dump. You can take it. Take all of it. In fact, if you give me no money, if you just pretend you're stealing, I won't chase you. Like my wife is not the same way. She's like, no, we can't just give that away. I'm like, please, we can give that away. The things that you love in this life end up in a garage sale and people offering you quarters for. It always fails you. And he's going to make that really clear right here. May be found to result in praise and glory and honor at the revelation of Jesus Christ. Now, I don't think this is talking about us praising and honoring Jesus, although that will happen. I think what he's talking about is this salvation that is greater than gold is going to pay dividends. When Jesus shows up, it will be honoring and it'll be for your glory and for your good that you knew the one who saved you. Your stuff doesn't do that. Your stuff does not do that, right? Dan's car is in an undisclosed location in another state, right? He pulled up in a rental car and we're like, wow. Like anytime someone gets a rental car, at least around this place, we're like, that's a sweet car. Yeah, that's where we're at. We're like, man, that rental car is awesome, right? When he pulls back up in his car, we're not gonna be like, you look so good in that. Well, I just don't think that's gonna happen. I don't think Dan's gonna pull into the parking lot upstairs and go, I've been so honored by this car. This car is my glory. I don't think that's what he's saying. He might have already talked to some of you about buying it if you'd pick it up. Like, I think I've heard that already, right? Your stuff doesn't make you look good at the end of its life. It makes you look dumb. It makes you look like a hoarder. Your stuff doesn't lead to your glory. It leads to your own shame because you wasted your entire life chasing after stuff that can't make you happy. There's something about faith because faith leads to a relationship with Jesus that is better than anything. It's found to result in praise and glory and honor when Jesus comes back. Now, it's also a reminder that Jesus is going to return, a promise that Jesus is coming back. One of my favorite stories, we'll get to in a second, you'll see Jesus float away, but the promise is he's coming back physically. Now, he shifts gears. Verse 8. We're going to talk about, there's three things that he tells the believer that are to be true of them. It's love, belief, and joy. Okay? Love, belief, and joy. Verse 8. Though you have not seen him, you love him. Now, if I were to take a quick poll, like everyone in First Service lied to me. They all lied to me. They didn't laugh at my jokes. And they didn't, even you laugh at when I'm not joking. It's great. It was hard. It was a rough morning and it didn't go well, right? So I said, how many of you, if you could choose like 3 days at Cannon Beach or a week with Jesus, which one would you pick? And I don't know, first group's like, I don't know. Like, you're for reals right now? Like, what's wrong with you? Am I the only person in the world that's like, I can go to the beach later? It's cold anyways. It's going to rain. I would love to hang out with Jesus. Or how many of you thought this? You read through the New Testament and you read stories of what Jesus did and you go, if I could have seen that, I would never doubt again. How many of you have been there? Never doubt. I would never doubt. You put me on a boat in a storm where I think I'm going to die, and then guy tells the storm to stop it, and it listens, I'm in. Right? We go and see people at the hospital, and he's just high-fiving them, and they're walking out, I'm in. Right? He's feeding us, he's creating food out of nothing. This guy tells dead people they can't be dead anymore. How could you not believe that? Man, if I could have seen that, then I would really believe. The reason I doubt is because I've actually just never seen. Well, Peter disagrees with you. And listen, Peter saw him. Think about Peter's unique relationship to Jesus when he says this, though you have not seen him, you love him. Like, listen, you ever seen someone famous? Like, you take a picture of them, try to be discreet. You're never discreet, right? You're like, I'm texting my friend, right? And then you send a picture and you're like, guess who I just saw? Like, if I were Peter, that's probably what this section would be like. Be like, hey, remember Jesus, my best friend? Yeah, we were cool. Want me to tell you some stories? Yeah, I knew him. He knew me. He named me. He renamed me. That's what I'd be doing. I'd be telling people how close I was with this guy. Peter doesn't do that. He looks at a church that's never seen Jesus. Geographically, they would have never seen Jesus. They didn't get to see the resurrection of Jesus. They didn't get to see the ascension of Jesus. They didn't get to see the ministry of Jesus. They didn't see anything. They're like you and me. They've got one thing, and that's faith. He looks at him and he says, you haven't seen him, but you love him. And the word love is a present tense verb. Not you would have loved him. And you would have loved him if you would have met him. That's not what he's saying. He's not saying someday when you meet him, you'll really like him. He's great. He's saying you right now actively love him even though you've never seen him. Hebrews 11 says this, now faith is the assurance of things hoped for, the conviction of things not seen. Conviction of things not seen. Man, I can't tell you how many times in my life being skeptical, filled with doubt, I go, man, I would have loved to see Jesus because then I wouldn't doubt. And then I read Peter's life and I go, I think I might have. He goes on, though you do not now see him, you believe in him. So not only have you not seen him presently, but you don't see him, you're not going to see him for a while. Though you do not now see him. So not only did you never meet him, you never see him, you don't see him. He's basically telling you a lot of ways you've never met him. But you believe in him. Same thing, the idea of belief is trust. It's active and it's present tense. Man, if you would have seen him, you would have believed in him. He doesn't say that. He says, even though you don't see him right now, you believe in him. You actively trust in him. One of my favorite stories in all the Bible is in Acts 1:11. Jesus has ascended to heaven. That's a fancy term for he literally flew away. Like that never happens. Like it doesn't happen in your life. It's never happened in my life. You've never been talking to someone and they're like, well, see ya. But that's never happened. If you thought that happened, it didn't happen, okay? Jesus goes to heaven. That's a crazy moment. You ever watched like a rocket take off? You just stare at it. You ever watched a balloon? You ever let your kid let a balloon go? You just watch it forever. You've long lost sight of it and you're still looking for it. You ever done that? Don't lie. First group lied about it too. Y'all have done it, right? So they're clearly like, I don't know where he went, looking at the sky. And then an angel shows up, a couple angels, as if this couldn't have been more terrifying. Men of Galilee, why do you stand looking into heaven? I don't know, because Jesus just flew away. That would be my first answer. Like, how is this shocking to them? Like, what are you guys looking at? I don't know, the only person, except for Elijah, that's ridden away into heaven, that's a big deal. Then they say this Jesus who was taken up from you into heaven will come in the same way as you saw him leave. This Jesus is coming back. So Peter's saying, though you don't now see him. Listen, living hope, living Savior, you'll still see him someday. Whether you die and go to see him or he comes back to be with us, someday you're going to see him. Believe means trust. It means putting my confidence, my assurance in the promises of God. Let me give you a great example in the Bible. A guy named Thomas. And we always give Thomas a hard time. What do we call him? Doubting Thomas. That's a rude title. I would have doubted way more than Thomas. And let's be honest, so would you. All of your friends are at a house, and they tell you that Jesus is alive and that he came and saw them. How many of you are like, prove it? Come on. Are you kidding me? Someone's died. You watched him be buried, and their friends are like, yeah, he's alive. You're like, no, he isn't. And we're like, doubting Thomas. What? I'd be asking the same question. So Thomas is like, here's the deal. Here's the deal. I'll believe it when I can touch him. Listen, that's fair, because what did they just tell him? Jesus was here. Okay, cool. Then he can prove it to me. John 20, verse 29, Jesus said to him, have you believed because you have seen me? Yes. That is exactly why. 100%. What did he say? I don't believe it till I see it. Jesus, unfortunately, hears and knows all things, even if he's not in the room, shows up and says, now do you believe that you've seen? Thomas is like, oh man, I'm going to get a nickname for the rest of human history for this. Then he says this. Notice what Jesus says next. Blessed are those who have not seen yet believed. Here's the implication. You did not have to see Jesus to love him. And when you live wishing that you could have lived someone else's life or seen what someone else lived, you take away the promise that Jesus made to you. He promised you didn't have to see him to know him. You didn't have to see him to believe him. The testimony of the resurrection, of the ministry of Jesus, is accounted and documented by eyewitnesses, but you and I don't have to be eyewitnesses to be followers. Though you do not now see him, you believe in him. And then he ends with this, and rejoice with joy that is inexpressible and filled with glory, obtaining the outcome of your faith, the salvation of your souls. Now, what do you think Peter could say about Jesus? He could say a lot of stuff. You could make the argument between him and John, no one was closer to Jesus. No one spent more time with Jesus. No one had more conversations with Jesus. If you were to write, like he could have written a lot of things about what Jesus said and did. And what he ends with is there's a joy in my life, not because I spent time with him, not because I knew him better than you, not because I got to see miracles, but because God saved me. It's when you would ask Peter, this is essentially someone saying, Peter, tell me about Jesus. He goes, I can't put into words. I have no words. That God loved me enough to come into this world and save me. I got no words for that. Like if anyone could share some words about Jesus, it was Peter, and yet he doesn't. Filled with glory, obtaining the outcome of your faith, the salvation of your souls. Loving Jesus and trusting Jesus lead to joy in Jesus. Listen, if the joy of the Lord is not with you, you might not be trusting him, and you might not be loving him. Sometimes we talk about our walk with Jesus in the past tense. Well, I used to be really on fire for the Lord. I used to hear that at camp all the time. I didn't even know what that meant. I'll just be honest with you. I don't really know what it means to be on fire. Like you just get really worked up. What does that mean? Because the Bible talks about steadiness, steadfastness, reminding yourself of the gospel and living in relationship with him. Love and belief lead to praise. The greatest treasure in all of this world is not the stuff you're going to one day sell at your garage sale. It's not the car that you've been looking at online, trying to convince your wife that you deserve it. That's not it. It's not clothes, it's not a house, it's not a promotion, it's not a relationship, it's none of those things. In 100 years, you're gone, it's gone, it doesn't matter. But in 100 years, eternity has just begun. And there is no greater joy than to be known by the God who has made a way for you to be right with him. Obtaining the outcome almost feels like white-knuckling it. So I've worked at Christian camps a lot in my life. And there's things that Christian camps do that like encourage faith. And it's basically scary devices in the air. We used to be at this one and it had like a, what do you call it, a zip line? But like we didn't harness, you just held on. And like it seemed like a fine idea until you got to the middle. You're like, oh my gosh, if I let go, I'm dead, right? Or at least my legs are dead, right? And then they're like, you just hold on. Because if you hold on, you're not going to die. And it's great incentive to hold on really, really tight. You either let go at the very beginning or you let go at the very end, but you don't let go in the middle. And sometimes we read this, obtaining the outcome of your faith, and we go, okay, I just got to white knuckle, I got to hold on. That's not what he's saying. Because he's already told you that the God in his kindness and providence has guarded you through faith. What he's telling you is, however long this lasts, however much it hurts, whatever type of suffering you are in right now, whatever type of suffering you will face in the future, whatever it is, you're going to win. The outcome of this is not a lifetime and an eternity of suffering. The outcome of this is a lifetime of suffering and an eternity of glory. That's why in Revelation 21, we see that Jesus wipes away every tear from the eye, which shows it hurt. Let's not pretend it doesn't hurt. Let's not pretend life is easier than it is. Let's not be a bunch of Christian people that talk about how blessed it is to be you and how easy your life is. It's not your life. And listen, if that's your life right now, it will change one day. And life will be hard, and it'll be rough. And you're going to hurt, and you're going to ask God a lot of questions. Remember this in your suffering, that he is guarding you through faith. And that this outcome that you will get one day with new life in Jesus and a living hope and an eternity with him, that is guaranteed, not because you held on tight enough, but because he was good enough. Because he overcame, obtaining the outcome of your faith, the salvation of your souls. Praise Jesus that he has saved us. We're going to head into communion next. And here's what I want you to do. If you're a follower of Jesus in the room, I want you to ask yourself a few questions. Do you love him? Present tense, active, daily. Do you love him? Do you believe in him? Do you trust him? Present tense, actively. And do you find your joy in him? Believer, those should be true of you. If they are not true of you, suffering will be a lot worse. Suffering is going to come. In this world, you will have trouble. But if you love the Lord, if you are believing in the Lord, and if you have joy in the Lord, he will carry you. And if you are in the room today and you have no idea what that means, going to church has always been about lists of things you do and don't do. You say certain things, you don't say certain things. You try to be really good because someday Jesus is coming back, and it sounds a lot more like the Santa Claus story than it does the gospel. I want you to know him. The invitation for you to find a hope that lives beyond this life is open to you right now. Jesus talking about this tower that fell and killed people. He said, listen, today's the day. Today is the day. No, God wasn't out to get them, but if you live long enough, that will come for you. So while today is still today, I would encourage you, I would beg with you to know the Jesus that I know. Let's pray.